So a few days ago I watched this press conference, and it's a press conference featuring Quentin Tarantino and the cast of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now I'm really excited about this movie. I think this has been a great movie, and I'm really interested to know how excited you are to watch this movie. But in particular during this press conference, Quentin Tarantino was asked why Charles Manson is still so popular today, and Quentin Tarantino replied, and he says the whole background of Charles Manson is unfathomable. So Quentin Tarantino said that word. And I wanted to understand why Quentin Tarantino has that opinion towards Charles Manson. Because on the outside, it just seems that Charles Manson was a murderer. He built some sort of cult in the desert that went on to murder people. But it's actually far more complex than that. So when Quentin Tarantino says that it is unfathomable, I'm going to explain to you why that is. Now, I'm going to go through a number of celebrity connections that Charles Manson has, and they're very complex and very confusing. And that really is, again, why Quentin Tarantino says it's unfathomable. Now the first one is actually when Charles Manson was a teenager. So Charles Manson used to babysit for the children of Al Lewis, who played the role of Grandpa Munster. Now Munster Family was a very popular television show. And another celebrity connection is Bryan Cranston. So Bryan Cranston claims that when he was a teenager, he went horseback riding through the Spahn Ranch. And the Spahn Ranch was where Charles Manson and the Charles Manson family lived. And Bryan Cranston has confirmed that he claims that he saw Charles Manson when he was about 13. But this is actually where it starts to get really confusing, and it's based on the music industry. So Neil Young, who is a very popular musician, he says that he met Charles Manson, and he actually tried to get Charles Manson a record contract a short period before the murders of Sharon Tate. But when Charles Manson was in prison, he actually wrote to both Marilyn Manson and Phil Spector. Firstly, Charles Manson demanded money from Marilyn Manson because Marilyn Manson had used Charles Manson's surname. Now the other person was Phil Spector. So Phil Spector is currently serving a prison sentence for murder. But Phil Spector was a very popular and very successful record producer, and Charles Manson wanted to work with Phil Spector whilst they were both in prison and to make music together. But another person that Charles Manson met in prison was Phil Kaufman. Now this was actually in the mid-1960s, but Phil Kaufman went on to become a road manager for a number of very successful bands, including the Rolling Stones and the Byrds. And one of the members of the Byrds was Graham Parsons, and Phil Kaufman actually dug up the dead body of Graham Parsons and took his dead body to a forest and burned it. And that was a pact that Phil Kaufman and Graham Parsons had together. But as I said, Graham Parsons was a member of the Byrds. Now the record producer for the Byrds was Terry Melcher, who was the son of Doris Day. Now Terry Melcher actually met Charles Manson on a number of occasions and nearly offered Charles Manson a record contract. So what happened was Charles Manson actually tried to murder Terry Melcher at his home, but Terry Melcher had moved out the house and Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski had moved in. So Charles Manson actually murdered the wrong person. Charles Manson wanted to murder Terry Melcher, but because he had moved out and Sharon Tate moved in, the Charles Manson family actually murdered Sharon Tate almost by mistake. She was at the wrong place at the wrong time and was murdered, yet she was completely innocent in the eyes of Charles Manson. But at the time, Terry Melcher was dating Candice Bergen. So if you're wondering how Charles Manson found out where Terry Melcher or Sharon Tate lived, what happened was Terry Melcher was dating Candice Bergen, and Candice Bergen was also friends with Dennis Wilson. And what happened was Dennis Wilson was driving along and he saw a hitchhiker, and he gave that hitchhiker a lift. And that hitchhiker was actually a member of the Charles Manson family, and that led to Charles Manson and around a dozen people moving into the home of Dennis Wilson. Now Dennis Wilson was the drummer for the Beach Boys, and on one night he gave Candice Bergen a lift home to Terry Melcher's house, but also in the car was a member of the Charles Manson family. So that is how Charles Manson found the home of where Terry Melcher was living. But Terry Melcher actually went on to move out of that house and Sharon Tate moved in. Now as I said, Dennis Wilson was the drummer for the Beach Boys, but the actual singer for the Beach Boys was Mike Love, and he had children. Now one of the babysitters for those children was Suzanne Atkins, and Suzanne Atkins was one of the people that went on to murder Sharon Tate. But this is actually a quote from Quentin Tarantino regarding another of Quentin Tarantino's characters, Daisy Dermigue, from the movie The Hateful Eight. So Quentin Tarantino says, a Manson girl out west, like Suzanne Atkins or something. So this shows that Quentin Tarantino is very familiar with the concept of the Charles Manson family and very comfortable about talking to them openly, even before he's made the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now this is actually where it starts to get even more complex and confusing. So when Quentin Tarantino says that the whole background of Charles Manson is unfathomable, this is really why it's so complex. So Margaret Cain says that he was introduced to Charles Manson at a party, and he was introduced to Charles Manson by a singer called Mama Cass. But actually this photo here from 20th of January 1969, this is the wedding reception of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. But alongside Michael Caine in this photo is Candice Bergen, and the reason is that in 1968 they appeared in a movie together called Magus. So Michael Caine was introduced to Charles Manson, but he appeared in a movie with the girlfriend of Terry Melcher, who Charles Manson really wanted to murder, but he actually went on to murder Sharon Tate, who's this lady here in this photo. But again, this is where it gets even more complex. So Michael Caine says that at that same party was Jay Sebring. Now Jay Sebring was a hairstylist, and he actually used to date Sharon Tate before Sharon Tate married Roman Polanski, and Jay Sebring was one of the people murdered alongside Sharon Tate at her home. So this shows that Charles Manson was actually at a party, and he was introduced to Michael Caine by a singer called Mama Cass, but also at that party was one of the victims that he would go on to murder, but he didn't actually mean to murder that person. He actually meant to murder Terry Melcher, who was the record producer who refused to offer Charles Manson a record contract. Now, as I said, Michael Caine says that he was introduced to Charles Manson by a singer called Mama Cass. Now, this is Mama Cass. Now, actually, Mama Cass was a very popular singer, and she actually features in the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So Quentin Tarantino has put this singer as a character in his movie, and there's a very specific reason why Mama Cass is actually features in the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And the reason is that Mama Cass also made music with a gentleman called Dave Mason. So this is the cover here. So it says Dave Mason and Cass Elliot, and Cass Elliot is the real name of Mama Cass. And Dave Mason says that Mama Cass met Abigail Folger and Witch Frykowski on a number of occasions, but these two people were also murdered by the Charles Manson family alongside Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring. So this shows that Mama Cass knew both Abigail Folger and Witch Frykowski, who were the murder victims of Charles Manson, and Mama Cass knew Charles Manson. So really, Mama Cass is in between these people. Mama Cass knew both the murder victims and the murderer. This is how complex this story really is. So as I said, when Quentin Tarantino says the background of Charles Manson is so unfathomable, this is why. Because these connections are so interwoven and so complex that it's almost unbelievable. So I believe that if Quentin Tarantino had more time at the press conference, he would have gone through these details. He would have explained just how unbelievable and how complex the backstory of Charles Manson is, and why this story of Charles Manson is still so popular even today. So if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below, and also like and subscribe. But for me, this is why that the background and history of Charles Manson is so unfathomable, because it's so complex. It's almost unbelievable to see and to think it actually took place. So again, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below, and also like and subscribe.